Okay, let's get started, shall we? It's a beautiful day. What I want to do is three things today in anticipation of the exam coming up in 2 days on Thursday, right here in this room at this time on Thursday. We'll be having a 50-question multiple choice exam. I think you all know that. You'd be surprised, though, once a quarter someone shows up and says, "Today's the exam, I had no idea." Yeah, it's on Thursday, that'll be the exam. And what I want to do today are three things to help you sort of move in that direction. One is to answer any questions you might have about the material that will be on the exam. So I'm happy to fill in any gaps that aren't clear from the study guide, answer any questions, any ambiguities that you're struggling with, help you find things. And I think that the fact that you're all in the room is even better, so you'll all be able to hear that. Second thing I want to do is talk a little bit about study strategy and how to close effectively at this point, and also how to take the exam, I think, in the most effective way possible. And the third thing I want to do is offer some concluding thoughts about all that we've done over the past 10 weeks. And also, if you have any questions, not just about the class, but about the relevance of this material for relationships in general, I'll take those questions and we'll have a discussion at that point. So 3 things. Review what's on the exam, talk about how to proceed from this point forward on the exam, and finally, just to have a few more comments about the class itself. So let's start in with the exam and content of the exam, and any questions you might be having at this point about things that haven't been really clear from the study guide, or stuff that you're not sure about, questions about maybe what to emphasize as you study in these next couple days. Yeah? Correct. I am not lecturing. What I did is I played some couples therapy videos instead, so I sort of spread that out a little bit. So Chapter 13 is on the exam. There's no lecture on Chapter 13, but the material in the book will be on the exam. I believe there are 3 or possibly, maybe it's 4 or 5 questions on the exam from Chapter 13. Good question. Other questions? Here's a question I've been getting. What's the deal with how many battered women leave their relationships? That is in a special focus box in Chapter 8. Okay? Other questions here? Yes?
Could you talk a little bit about the difference between proximal and distal contexts and how they influence each other?
Yeah, it's a good question. So you remember from, and as we get to, talking a little bit more about the end of the class, I'll get to this slide, so don't worry about this right now. Remember from this lecture, the Chapter 11 lecture, we talked about context. We talked about the idea that whereas we typically think of our relationships as just me and this other person and whatever it is we're dealing with, a more thoughtful reflection on what really happens in our relationships takes into account that we exist in certain contexts of time, contexts of stress, other people, jobs, schools, opportunities, laws, etc. Right? So we exist in complex contexts, and those contexts matter. Right? So when we think about how to wrap our heads around that complexity, we start to gravitate toward this model that a guy named Yuri Bronfenbrenner came up with, right? This is the model where it's sort of the concentric circle picture. I can even pull that up. Huh? This idea. So this idea, right? This is Savion, where you are. So there we are in the middle, right? So that's where we spent 9 weeks of our time focusing on that one complicated little circle in the middle. And the point I was trying to make with this slide is that there are influences right around us that are going to affect how we think about our lives and how our relationships are going to unfold. But those layers, the immediate circumstances around us, are themselves embedded in other complicated contexts. You don't need to know those terms, like the macro system, the exosystem, the mesosystem, etc. But you need to appreciate this idea, right? That we find ourselves, for example, when the housing crisis hit, or the global economic crisis hit in 2007, there were issues that affected couples directly because there were laws about what banks were able to do with their money that actually allowed people like me, to get a lot more money to borrow a lot of money that we actually couldn't pay off, right? So there were laws in place that said you can get a lot of money, even more than you're able to pay back, to rent a house. That's sort of a contextual issue. And when jobs started to become less plentiful and houses started to be taken away from people, that middle bubble changed a lot for a lot of people, right? So people's experiences in their relationships became tremendously stressful. So the idea is that there was a distal context, an outside context, in this case about how the financial markets operated, that entered directly into the more proximal, more immediate circumstances that affected our lives. So that's an example of a very distal context, a kind of a law that would affect how our lives are influenced by these broader forces outside of our house, outside of our lives, but in our communities and in our nation. And that penetrated really right into the nature of the homes that we're living in, and as a result, that left people having to struggle with a lot of difficult circumstances. So the idea is that there are proximate influences, stuff that's really close to us that matters and that we can pay attention to, and that without much reflection, all of us could say, oh yeah, my commute's really long and that's a hassle. It's because I live in LA and I can't afford an apartment right on the Westwood corridor, right, on Wilshire Boulevard. Turns out I can't get that penthouse suite that I see every night when I'm walking my dog, that big 2-story penthouse suite. I have a commute and I live in the San Fernando Valley. That's the way things are for me. We can see those immediate circumstances, but we have to do a little extra effort to see that those circumstances are themselves a consequence of very big forces. The other example I give down here is also a good one, I think, which is there are these distal influences like the legalization of gay marriage that is happening right now in our country, and that is really going to provide people who in the past had not had the opportunity to have, say, legal control over end-of-life decisions for their partners, right? So there are these big distal changes that are happening in our society that we can't just think of as, oh, it's a good idea that people of all kinds are able to marry. What I want you to appreciate is that there are influences that come from that actually over time will affect the health and well-being of many people in this country. So that's the basic idea. In terms of what you need to know on the exam, you might see those proximal distal terms, but the big idea here is that our relationships are embedded in contexts, and that a given couple, and I started this lecture right here saying that a relationship between two people, just by chance, if it ends up in a very difficult circumstance, a difficult set of circumstances for whatever reason, like the example of the couple who, and I showed a picture of the couple whose daughter was killed in an accident, right? That couple has to deal with a certain circumstance that they hadn't planned for, hadn't anticipated, but we really have to know that if we want a deep understanding of how relationships unfold. So what do you need to know for the exam? Just a basic appreciation that the same relationship in different contexts is going to end up being a very different kind of relationship, right? Contexts shape us and our experiences.
In terms of the questions on the exam, what proportion of the questions are coming straight from lecture and are not included in the book at all?
I haven't tallied that up. So the question is, what's the book versus lecture breakdown? Let me...
There was some overlap, but like stuff that was purely in the lecture.
You want to know how much is purely from the lecture that's not in the book?
Yeah.
Oh. I would say not much. Because my typical strategy when I give a lecture is to say, what's interesting in the chapter? And I pull that out of the chapter, and I really try to emphasize it. If I emphasized it in lecture, and it appeared in the study guide, there's a very high likelihood that that will appear on the exam. But it's unlikely for me to come up with something. It's not impossible, but it's unlikely for me to come up with something completely independent of material in the book. So, good question. Yeah?
Could you give an example of the justification bias and the accuracy bias in a conversation?
In a conversation?
Or like how it influences the interpretation of one word?
So a justification bias and an accuracy bias. So this goes back to our chapter 10 lecture, right, where we talked about cognitive processing. And keep in mind that when we talk about cognitive processing, we're making a switch from where we were in chapter 7 before the midterm, and chapter 8, the first thing after the midterm. And when scientists got interested in relationships, they got really interested in the transactional properties, right? Well, how do people talk to each other? What are people doing in ways that affect the other person? What are we doing? And it's no surprise that the behavioral model, the behavioral perspective, became really sort of salient and crucial. And it's no surprise that that social learning idea, that idea that you talk to me and it affects me and I talk to you and it affects you, it's no wonder that that became the basis for one of the best therapies that we have, right? And so that's chapter 12, integrative behavioral couples therapy, traditional behavioral couples therapy. It's all about how do we sort of control and govern and manipulate the emotional tone of our conversations. So we got interested in relationships, especially in the 60s as the divorce rate was going up, because of these interpersonal properties. It seemed really interesting, and I think you can see that this class feels different than a lot of other classes that you've had in psychology, which are really about memory or characteristics of the individual or personality traits or motivations that are located in the individual. We try to find things that are located between people, and that's what makes relationships so fascinating. At the same time, we can't leave that intra-psychic, the intra-individual perspective alone. We have to understand how the filters exist between the things that you might say to me and how they really register with me, right? And so we saw that in Nadine and Frank, right? We saw the second version of the Nadine and Frank video of how they were miscommunicating now. We also saw that in the Story of Us video, right? So that the manner in which two people in a relationship respond to one another's behaviors and interpret one another's behaviors really contributes to the topography of that conversation, right? So there is a deep cognitive part of our relationships that I want you to understand. And within that lecture, I talked about different kinds of motivated reasoning, right? We're not neutral processors of information. In fact, you even heard about that when we talked about the intimacy process model. Remember that from the midterm. That's not on this exam, but it's this idea that you say something to me, there's a filter, I register that, and the way that I respond to you is going to affect how close we feel. Right? So we're not unbiased, neutral processors of information. And when we think about what the nature of the biases are, we think about times when we are really motivated to justify our points of view, right? So often what happens in our conversations when we feel like we and our partners are adopting different points of view in a conversation, often what happens is that we naturally feel like we have to justify our perspective and our point of view. As human beings, we really do try to defend ourselves and represent our point of view well. And lots of times that's really important, and in a relationship we want to do that. But when it's defensive or when it is counterproductive and it doesn't sort of advance our ability to solve the problem, when I defend myself and I justify what I've done as being right, and you as my partner do the same thing, we often clash, right? And so the way to so that is the justification idea, right? Is that we're human beings. We do things for reasons, and when we do something, even when we screw up, lots of times we have a really good rationale, a really good reason for why we did that. We justify what we've done. We want to believe that we're right most of the time. Right? It's hard to go through life thinking that you're always wrong and that you don't have good explanations for your behavior. We're really good at making up explanations for our behavior. So that's a justification motive. There are other times, though, in our relationships when we want to be accurate, when we want to really be striving toward objective information. So, for example, if there is a conversation, if you and your partner have engaged in conflict and you say, why do we always get locked into this? What's going on here? And you might say, well, we need some accurate information. We need a basis, some sort of shared reality that allows us to say, how are we going to make sense of this? We care about each other. We keep getting stuck in these traps. What's going on? And at that point, you can say, well, let's really try to sit down and think about this. Let's really sort of think this through. Let's recommit ourselves to this issue or our relationship or whatever it is. And in many ways, going to see a therapist is also a strategy for getting accurate information. Right? You say, we need a third party here. We need someone else to sort of weigh in and help us to see where we are being biased and remind us also why we got to this relationship to begin with. So the accuracy motive is really different from the justification motive, and it's an attempt to sort of impose a corrective onto maybe some of the rough spots that we're encountering in the relationship. You might remember from that lecture, the Chapter 10 lecture, February 19th, in which I talked about a person who believed that their partner might have been having an affair on that, might have been screwing around on the side, right? And there are these transitional moments in our relationship when usually when we're committing to our partner in a new way, when we're solidifying the relationship. So before you really agree to marry somebody, for example, you might say, let me think this through. This is a big decision. Let me get some accurate information. Let me check with my friends. They know me well. Let me really find out what my partner's about, right? So there's times when we really need accurate information. When we feel like our relationship is in trouble or it might be in trouble, we want to know that we're basing our decisions on real facts. When we are about to start going out with somebody who we just met on Tinder or the eHarmony website, we might want to do a Google search on them and find out what they're about, right? There are times when, before we make a decision, we want to get some more accurate information. So those are the ways in which, what do we call those, that whole domain of stuff? Motivated reasoning, right? That's going to be on the exam. Good question, good question. Other questions like that? Yeah?
On this study guide, you paired Hillary Clinton with accommodation, and so it kind of made me confused as to accommodation, assimilation, which category would her situation fall in, or if you could just talk about accommodation, assimilation in general.
Sure. Accommodation is changing your belief structure based on new information. Assimilation is having your existing belief structure work for you given that a new circumstance has arisen, right? And so this is in Chapter 13, I think, Accommodation and Assimilation. It's in Chapter 10? Okay. I did not write either Chapter 10 or Chapter 13, so my head is a little fuzzy on those. The idea, I cannot vouch for for whether that was a typographical error or that was something that you really need to know. You totally need to know Hillary Clinton. She does appear on the exam, okay? And it's about this idea in the cognitive processing lecture that her husband did something that most of us would say is a very severe threat to a relationship, right? He had an affair with Monica Lewinsky. And what I want you to know about Hillary Clinton and that lecture is, by the way, you still see pictures of them, snuggling up with each other, Bill and Hillary Clinton. So something happened Whereas many of us, if we had had that experience in our relationship, our partner really betrayed us in some important way, most of us would probably leave that relationship. Hillary Clinton did not leave that relationship, and I presented some of the psychological operations that she went through, not to deny that that event happened. She didn't deny that it happened. In fact, it was in the news every day. She could not deny that it happened. But to reorient herself toward the negative information that she was dealing with. So in our relationships, we have the capacity to process information that is more benign or the opposite, malign, malignant, that we sort of see, take what might be neutral or slightly negative behavior on the part of our partner and sort of magnify it, right? Or we can take that and say, here's how I'm seeing that. And for her, it was saying, he's not a bad guy. He screwed up. This is not because he's a person who's trying to hurt me. This is a person who's suffering. And I have to respond to a person who's struggling like that. This is a weakness. This is not that he's a bad guy inherently. He made a bad decision, and I want to respect that. I want to instead of running away from him or yelling at him, I want to embrace him and let him know that this is a good relationship where we can solve that problem. So that's what's interesting about Hillary Clinton. You will see that. So check back in on that slide. The accommodation assimilation point, while it does apply in a loose sense to that circumstance in this specific way, she was assimilating this new event within the cognitive structures that she already had, right? Oh, I'm a good person. I am a person who's willing to give people the benefit of the doubt even when they do something very bad. I think she even referenced Christian theology. And she said, you know, as a Christian person, this is how I've been trained to understand other people's misbehaviors. I don't see them as, character flaws. I see them as characteristics of who they are, and that we can help people to become better and stronger. You and I might not have done that. The circumstances are always going to differ for us. But the idea was that she was able to say, this event happened, I can assimilate that into who I am. Another person might have said, well, I'm going to actually change my beliefs based on what my partner said. They might have said, well, I used to always believe that if my partner ever did that, I would stick around. But now that it's happened, I'm not going to stick around. Right?
Wouldn't that be accommodation?
That part would be. Right, if she then changed her beliefs, that would be accommodation. Yeah. Question?
Can you also say she was assimilating because she reconfirmed her beliefs about him still being a good guy and everything?
Absolutely. So her beliefs about herself and about him were really sort of echoed and reinforced in that experience. Yeah. Question?
Could you differentiate between spillover and projection? Because they sound like similar.
So it's a spillover versus projection point.
Yeah.
Projection is from chapter 12, right? And this is the idea that I have needs and wants and desires, some of which I don't fully appreciate and understand, but then I impose those on you, and then I respond to them, and then that sort of becomes a characteristic of our relationship. So the idea would be that I have very strong needs for someone to take care of me, and I project that onto you, that you should be the person who takes care of me, and that any failing on your part to not do that becomes a basis upon which I would judge you, right? So I say, you know, in some vague, even unspecified way, if I grew up in a family where, you know, every time I needed something, some emotional comfort from another person and I didn't get it, that left me moving into adulthood with that as something that I was really looking for in a partner, even if I wasn't able to really explicitly say that. And so I would then enter relationships and say, you know, this is something that I need in relationships. I'm going to project this onto you. You're going to be the person who does this for me. And if you do that, great. But if you don't, that's going to be the basis upon which I judge you. And so that's sort of kind of an unfairness, right? It's like I create my image of my partner and then I respond to my image of my partner. So that's the projector, just like a kind of a projector like this, right? This thing gets projected onto the screen and then we deal with it. But the individual themselves is the one doing the projecting. Now that is different from spillover, mainly in the sense that when we talk about spillover, we're talking about the transfer of stress in our lives, okay? So whereas projection is really a concept that becomes most salient, most noticeable in the therapy context, and that's where you'll see it. The idea of spillover is really, in many ways, much more simple. So it is that I have experiences outside the home or outside my relationship. I carry those with me into a new circumstance. I then come home. I'm then dealing with my partner, and that spills over to affect the way I talk to my partner, right? And you can see how that sort of relates to this, right? There's sort of a spilling over of my negative, usually negative emotion. I bring that into my conversations. And crossing over, I think you know, is that you then adopt, inherit, absorb those negative experiences that I have, right? And that's that there's sort of a contagion of negative experiences in relationships, unless you explicitly acknowledge it. So one thing that good support can do is, rather than just sort of at the end of the day get caught up in these negative exchanges, check in with your partner and see how things are going so that you're not blindsided by the stress that your partner's dealing with or that you're dealing with. Yeah.
Where's Alexis and Steve from?
What, say again?
Alexis and Steve.
Alexis and Steve, that's an online video. Yep. A couple more questions, one or two more questions, then I want to move on to some ideas about, how to, not just what to study, but how to study. Yeah. For what? Why? What is what?
Confirmation bias is under accuracy and not enhancement. Because it would seem you would keep it in line with the enhancement bias.
I wouldn't worry about that.
Okay.
Don't worry about it. I mean, those terms are going to be on the exam, but my goal with my questions is not to split hairs. And you're not to say you're splitting hairs. You're really trying to answer a good question. But if you know the concepts, you don't need to know why they're located in certain places. You'll be okay.
Can I ask another question?
Absolutely. Everybody gets 2 questions, so we'll be here for a long time.
Can you explain interjective projection, exactly like the process of what that means? Is the person at that point then understanding their partner as their partner, or can they still be having that projective idea?
Okay. Object relations theory is one of the models of couples therapy, right? And it has this psychodynamic flavor to it. And remember that I talked about a number of different models of intervention with different targets, and you'll need to know those. But they're pretty distinct, right? And the distinct feature of the object relations model is that there are interpretive processes occurring in our relationships, sometimes out of our awareness, like that projection idea I was just talking about, right? And that a therapist would say, if we just sort of clear up that miscommunication and make that authentic so that I'm not just projecting my needs onto you and then I deal with you, I'm actually dealing with you as a real person, right? So it's not my needs that I use to define you, it's you and what's going on with you, right? So there's this sense that there are psychological processes, very hard to measure, by the way. That's why, remember I said that many of the models of couples therapy really have not been well tested, IBCT and TBCT and emotion-focused therapy being the exceptions. So these are complicated things to measure and study, but that hasn't stopped object relations theorists from thinking that they're really quite important and using this as a model for how they then work with a couple in therapy. So projective identification is this idea that my partner would say something to me, and that I would then register that and acknowledge that as a possible way of who I really am. So it's sort of taking in, introjecting, like putting that inside of me and saying, there's actually some legitimacy and validity to what they're saying. So, yeah.
What's in this one aspect of social networks?
Of
I saw network density, high density, low density. Isn't that social networks?
are you can I see that?
Sorry, I'm in a study guide.
Oh, so this is from where now exactly? The book?
Yes.
Yeah. So this is the same chapter, and it's about social networks. So this is again this idea that, by the way, you could sell that and make a lot of money. This is the idea that the people around us can determine the fate of our relationships, right? So you want to think about who the social actors are around us. I mean, think of your friends, think of your aunts and uncles, think of your parents as influences on not just who you are in the sense of like all that chapter 6 material that we talked about before the midterm, not just what your personalities are or what your traits are like or your attachment styles, all that. Whether your parents had a good relationship, etc. But now we're talking about within this sort of idea, the peers who are around you, and see there's a peer group right there. You see it on the sort of like 4 or 5 o'clock there, right near that center circle. It's the idea that the people around us are going to have an influence on the partners that we choose, the partners who are available to us, the decisions that we make when our relationships get into trouble. So it's that idea. That's the specific point. It's really, with that question in this chapter, chapter 11, what you want to do is just have a sense of what are the affordances, what are the enabling effects of our social networks when it comes to relationships, who our partners happen to be, what we do when we get into trouble in our relationships, etc. So every time you feel like your own relationship isn't going well and you ask a friend for help, you're sort of tapping into that aspect of your social networks and using the people around you in a way to make your relationship stronger. One more question. Let's do one more question. By the way, I'm all caught up in my emails from last night. So if you sent me an email up to, I think, about midnight last night, I got that by this morning. I know I have a couple in my inbox right now that I'll get to later today. And if you have any questions, like if we can't get to your question right now, just send that to me. I'll try to bang out a quick response and really orient you very quickly to what you need to know. And I hope for those of you who have already done that, you feel like I've been able to give you like real guidance on how to connect up with that. And I'm happy to keep doing that. Like if you get stuck on something, send me a quick email and I will try to do my absolute best to get that back to you fast. So unless there's one last question about...
What the distinction is between density and overlap?
In networks?
Yeah.
Density and overlap? Yeah. Overlap refers to, it's sort of a dyadic property of your networks. So it's how much of my wife's network, say, would overlap with mine. Whereas density just means how many people are in those networks. Yeah. I think that is not a hair that I'm splitting on the exam, though. Yeah. Last one?
Okay, this question might be unanswerable just because I don't have the graph in front of me, but there was a graph that you used when you were talking about traditional behavioral couples therapy.
Okay.
And I had a lot of trouble understanding it.
Okay. There was a graph about traditional behavioral couples therapy, the effects of that intervention.
I think it was, just like the effectiveness of it. It was at the very end of our
6. I don't know if that helps for.
That was the couples therapy lecture, not the prevention lecture? I think that's right.
That was the interventions, how to make irons better.
Okay.
12 part.
The first part. Okay, so here's the question. It's an important question. Remember that there's these different models of couples therapy, right? So when you're a therapist, you want to have a basis upon which to respond, right? And sort of a reasoned foundation for saying, oh, if this couple comes in with this problem, I need to respond to them. I need to sort of know which levers to pull so that I can help this couple become happier, healthier, stronger, right? And I listed a number of different models, and each of those models has a different sort of flavor, like a different part of the phenomenal base that they emphasize, right? And I then said, well, traditional behavioral couples therapy has been the benchmark, right? So that's been remember I showed the picture of the gears, the gears together. Like, what are the mechanics of communication that allow people to just communicate better? So that was traditional behavioral couples therapy. Remember that? TBCT, traditional behavioral couples therapy. We've had that around since the late 70s. You heard about it in the theory lecture when I talked about Neil Jacobson and Gayla Margolin and social learning theory, right? So let's just pause on that moment. That's traditional behavioral couples therapy. And in a moment, I'm going to contrast that with integrative behavioral couples therapy, IBCT. And then I'm going to talk about this specific graph that we're sort of contending with right now, and how those two ideas differ and whether they actually help people become happier. But let's just pause for a moment, appreciate the TBCT idea, and if you were in class, our last class, I showed a videotape of a couple. By the way, it was the guy with the mullet. Okay, if you were here, you know who I'm talking about. And they were really struggling to get this whole thing worked out about keeping their house clean, right? So the idea was that intervention was all about the mechanics of communication. Like, so if you were in this intervention, if you were sort of getting a version of a traditional behavioral sort of mechanical communication-based intervention, you would be trained how to listen to your partner. And that seems obvious. Like, of course, I listen to my partner all the time. But actually, lots of times when we're listening to our partner, we've sort of activated a justification response, right? But, no, this is why you're wrong and why I'm right, right? So that's often how we communicate when we feel like we're on the emotional hot seat, right? When we feel like we're being accused of something, for example, unjustly. And so this traditional view of couple communication is all about, well, how do you get people just to communicate better? And it's this very basic skill approach. Like, okay, Joe, instead of defending yourself, now, of course, you're totally justified in thinking about defending yourself right now. But what I want you to do instead is just try to appreciate what your partner's saying, okay? And then what I'm going to have you do, and this is even harder, I'm going to have you repeat it back to her. So you really make sure that you understand what she's saying, right? And then you have the couple actually do that. So then Betty says this and this and this, and Joe says, so is this what you're saying? And it's sort of like the caricature of psychology that you see on TV shows, right? Which is, I hear what you're saying, right? That kind of idea. But that's sort of the mechanical approach. That's the traditional behavioral couples therapy model, okay? People got to that point in our field and said, that works pretty well, but can't we improve upon it? Like, it seems like sometimes couples don't want to change their behavior. Sometimes it's really hard for them to change the things that their partner says, I really need you to change this. So people then devised integrative behavioral couples therapy, right? And the genius idea here is that, and it's really a good idea, which is if the traditional view says change everything, the integrative model says there might be things you can't change. And if you can't change those things, maybe you and your partner should learn to accept those things. Okay, so that's where that idea of acceptance training comes from, right? And you'll see that, it's on the exam, you'll see it. It's in chapter 12. But it's this idea that instead of dealing with the mechanics of communication, you might just say, you know, this really bothers me about you and our relationship. And it just seems like that's going to be, like we keep arguing about that. And I keep wanting you to change, but maybe the more enlightened, mature thing is to say, I still love you even though that's true, right? So that's the integrative behavioral model, says, try to change what you can change, but try to accept what you can't change, right? So that's a smart idea, right? Like that's a really valuable theoretical advance, I think. Okay, so now we get this question of, all right, so what's the deal with this graph? The deal with the graph is there's no real difference after 2 years and even after 5 years between those two models. I would have thought, probably you would have thought, certainly my colleague here at UCLA who designed that intervention thought that the acceptance approach has to have better uptake, right? It has to just sort of create deeper roots in the relationship where people say, I accept you and what you're about, and we're going to be a happier, stronger couple. But when you actually do the study, TBCT and IBCT work out about the same. Okay? It's a surprise. Maybe emotion-focused therapy is going to be better. We still don't know, but that's the idea. And there's another idea in there, which is that couples therapy does work. Like we think of that as a main effect. If it's done right, it tends to work. But it has to be done right. And if it is done right, it may not matter what exact version you get yet.
Is acceptance training the same as tolerance building?
Acceptance training and tolerance building very similar. So acceptance training is this big idea of, you know, learning how to accept what your partner's about, even especially the things that you don't like about them. And tolerance building is one strategy for that. Yeah. Yeah, so tolerance building is one of the steps that a therapist would take in IBCT, the integrative model, which is just deal with it. Guess what? Deal with it. Which is sort of what your partner's probably been telling you all along anyway. Okay, so let me stop there. And if you have questions for me of this exact kind, just send them to me, okay? And I'll do my absolute best to bang those out, keeping in mind that I'll probably have more than a few of them. So I'll try to really respond quickly. A couple quick thoughts. How are we doing on time? Jeez, who's doing all the talking here? Okay. Okay, so a couple of thoughts about the exam. The study guide is going to get you pretty far. Okay, so really track the study guide closely. There's going to be a few things on the exam that maybe aren't on the study guide, but more than 90% of what you're going to see on the exam is on that study guide. Okay, so in terms of narrowing down the content, I really intended that for that to focus your efforts and to really get you oriented on what I think are the most important concepts. And those are, in almost all instances, those concepts will appear on the exam. Okay. In terms of strategy for, another strategy point on how to prepare for the exam, in addition to looking at that study guide and paying close attention to it, is when you are trying to learn something, all of the cognitive research shows that depth of processing gets you very far. Right? So if you've taken a cognitive psychology course, you already know this, which is the idea that if you can take a bit of information and sort of personalize it, make sure you understand it, relate it to a specific situation that you know about, connect it up to other ideas that you know about, that's sort of a deeper, richer way of representing it rather than just memorizing it and say ABC equals XYZ. Right? So you don't want to just memorize things. And one of the best ways to do that, I think, is to try, knowing those terms that I've given you on the study guide, try to look for ways to think about the question that will come, for which that will be the answer, right? So if that's on the exam, what would be the question that would get me to that spot, right? So part of the depth of processing that you want to do in my class and in every class is to say, oh, I get it. I know what that concept is. What would a question sound like in order for that to be the answer, right? So try to anticipate the question as best you can, right? Another quick point, and I've said this before, and I'll say it again because it really will help you, is chapters 8 and 12 are very strongly represented on the exam. Okay, I lectured on both of those more than once, more than one day. You know, you heard a week of lecture at least on that material, and those are slightly longer chapters in the book. They have sort of a natural break point in both of them. So chapter 8 has the more of the verbal conflict and disagreement part, and then the physical aggression component, right? So it's really, it could be 2 chapters almost. Chapter 12 has the therapy part and the prevention part, and in my head that's a big division. The lectures represented that. So in effect, on the exam itself, you will see sort of a double dose of those chapters, okay? And I think if I had to guess, chapter 12 might have even another 1 or 2 questions beyond where chapter 8 is, okay? Chapter 8, chapter 12, if you can really, like, if you, and I know you don't, but if you have extra time, I get it, I know. Chapter 8 and chapter 12 is where you want to invest. In terms of actually taking the exam, let me tell you that if you have a good strategy, use your strategy. You don't need to listen to me. You're in the moment. You know what works for you. But a couple of things to think about as you go through the exam. One is, go ahead and write on the exam. Like, you really should own the exam. We just shred those, we throw them out. They're after we're done with them, they're useless. So go ahead and write on those, right? You know, mark them up in whatever way makes sense for you. For me, if I were taking the exam, I would never deal with the Scantron until 5 minutes before I was done, right? I would only mark all the things I knew on the exam proper, and then with a few, maybe 5-7 minutes left, I would then transfer things back over. I would always go through and do the simple questions first. I would just do all the simple questions first and use it as a way of reminding yourself all the stuff that you really do know. Those become prompts for getting the material back fresh in your mind. So I would definitely do the easy questions first. Really save the harder questions for last. You know, you want to make sure that you get the easy questions. As you're going through the harder questions, you know, you probably do this anyway. Mark out the ones that you're pretty sure are wrong, the answers within a given option. Usually it'll feel like 2 answers are right for any given of these harder questions, that 2 answers might be right. And then, you know, you're sorting out between those. And what I used to do when I was an undergraduate is I would really try to take a few minutes at the very beginning of my, when I was taking exams, and I would just remind myself of the things that I knew were likely to be important. So even before I took the exam, I would say, all right, chapter 8 is this, chapter 9 is this, chapter 10 is this, and I would even put down concepts that I really knew I wanted to make sure I understood. Because lots of times you feel like you can know something, and then you get to the question, you say, oh shit, I thought I knew this. And so you really want to sort of register the idea firmly in your head before you get to the question itself, okay? Another thing to keep in mind as you're taking the exam, the last thing I want to tell you, is there is a difference between a response being a true statement and a response being an answer to the question that I've asked. Okay, let me say that again because it's important. So I'll ask a question, and there will be a really clear answer to it, right? And here if you say, here's a definition, then I give the definition, right? But one of the ways that I and your other faculty will distract you is by saying something else that's true as one of the answers. It's true, it just doesn't happen to be the answer to the question that we've asked, right? So not every response, not everything that's A, B, C, D, or E is wrong. There's more of a fit to the question. So sometimes what we try to do when we're distracting you is throwing you a true statement, and you go, oh, right, that's a true statement. I remember learning that exact thing. That must be the answer. And that's not true. That's not always true. Okay? So recognize that some of the distractors that you're going to see are true statements that are inappropriate within the context of that specific question. Okay? Other questions about the format of the test, not so much the substance of it? Okay, 50 questions, 5 response options. We should have plenty of time to get through all of it. Let me just conclude with a few last thoughts. I know we have a few minutes left. In what I hope that you've gotten out of this class. And I hope you see from this class that relationships are interesting. Like, you probably came to this class thinking that they're interesting, but as you dig into it, as you really sort of unpack each separate chapter, you say, wow, there's depth here, there's organization, there are phenomena here that not only can I relate to my own personal lives and my own personal relationship, but that they're just interesting, that this is how we as human beings have evolved, this is how we as human beings respond to one another, how we as human beings sort of respond to the difficult, challenging circumstances that exist all around us, right? That we see these phenomena like attributional processing, negative reciprocity, cognitive editing. All these things are amazing. And when you have a label for them and you then start to see them in what your parents are doing or what your roommate's doing, it becomes really interesting. It becomes even empowering to know that, oh, there's a difference between intimate terrorism and common couples violence, and they're really different, so that you now have a language not just to talk about different ways in which people mistreat each other, but really subtle ways in which people mistreat each other. And you can really sort of distinguish between them and know that there's a difference. One of the videos that I sometimes show, I didn't show this year, is a videotape of from an Oprah TV show, really interesting show, with a bunch of guys who've been physically abusive to their partners. And she says, at some point we're just going to eliminate violence from all intimate relationships. And the idea that you would do that without recognizing that there's different types of aggression in relationships is really sort of misguided, right? The idea that you'd want to make relationships healthy and strong and safe for everybody, great idea, but you have to begin by recognizing that there are differences and that different strategies would be required for keeping an intimate terrorist out of your life versus keeping common couples violence out of your life. Those are really different phenomena, right? So what I've hoped to have given you in this class is a beginning, just a very beginning way of understanding these different concepts and how they can come into our lives because they're interesting. But I think what I really want you to appreciate is not just how these ideas and concepts and phenomena all fit into you and your life, but how truly important our intimate relationships are, how fundamentally important, not just as something that's kind of incidental to how we live our lives, not just something that's going to come up every now and again, like maybe a condition that you'd learn about in abnormal psychology, for example, but a characteristic of who we are as human beings, and as a way of, not to say that there aren't other ways of finding meaning in our lives that don't involve other people in any direct or immediate way. Certainly that's true, that we can find meaning outside the context of our relationships, that we find comfort where we can come to know who we are outside of the intimate bonds that we might share with one another, that there will be significant spans of our life when maybe we don't want to be in relationships, and obviously that's desirable, expected, valued, and I'm not really saying that we always spend all of our time in relationships and that's the only way to think about ourselves. But it is an important way that we think about ourselves. We want to appreciate, and in our society it's very difficult to appreciate that we're so competitive in this society. We're so oriented to us succeeding and achieving, and goodness knows I want all of you to achieve every goal you've ever had in your life. But at the same time, we're embedded in relationships with other people. That what we really want is a society where not only can you have all the success that you want in your job or whatever occupation you pursue, but that we have a society where people are encouraged to take care of one another, right? Where people are really as Bronfenbrenner said, really enabled to take care of ourselves, to take care of one another. So we want to, let me get back to this slide. We want to get to circumstances where we can manage the world around us and hope that we help other people to have good relationships. There is something unique about our relationships that you can't get from other places. I can look in the mirror every day in the morning and say, you're a good-looking guy. Like, you're really buff, aren't you? You're aging well, right? I can say that every day when I look in the mirror. But if my wife says it, then it matters, right? Then it oh shit, I wasn't just making that up, right? And usually when I say it, I'm totally making it up, and it's really to sort of defend against the fact that I'm getting old and tired, right? But when somebody else says that, that is irreplaceable, right? That is really irreplaceable. And what I think we want to do is create relationships around ourselves, not only where we have that person delivering that kind of validation to us, really remembering how powerful that is, but also being the kind of person who says, this is going to matter to my partner. And it's not just about me. I'm going to reach out and make them a better person. That's a great idea on absolute grounds, unconditionally, but it also means you're in a relationship where that kind of exchange is going to be more common. And that's going to make you healthy, it's going to make you happy, and it's also going to allow you to thrive and your children to thrive as well. So that's what I hope you've gotten out of this class. And let me tell you, it's been an absolute joy for me to have you in this class. And I want to wrap up just by talking about this one slide that a couple of you have said, I'd like to hear about this, because I had to rush through this at the end of chapter 11. I was so busy talking about the couple that was living on minimum wage. But the idea is that stress is invisible, right? And that we tend to underestimate the effect of stress on ourselves and even worse on our partners. So the idea, and this isn't going to be on the exam, but it's just something that I want to leave you with, which is that stress matters. If you don't pay attention to stress, you will eventually, right? It can clobber you in the end. And this relates to what I was just saying, this idea that you have an amazing ability to regulate the emotions of another person. This is one of our profound capacities as human beings. And it gets back to one of the very first studies that I talked about, which was the hand-holding study. You remember the hand-holding study? This idea that if an individual is not just holding the hand of another person, but a person who they love and have a relationship with, that their experience of threat, in this case it was an MRI scanner, etc., but their experience of threat is dramatically reduced. We have this ability to nurture, to hold somebody physically, to talk to them in a way that recognizes their reference point, their point of view, and to make them feel better. And that's amazing. So you want to value your ability to do that and learn how to do that. You can really help your partner to live in a zone, to exist in a zone that is more nurturing and more comforting, that is free of as much threat as we can possibly be free of in our society. And at the same time, you shouldn't assume that your partner knows how to do that for you. You shouldn't say, I soothe you, therefore you should know how to soothe me, right? You should know how to sort of put me into a better emotional place. Don't assume that. Help your partner understand that. Help your partner figure that out, because you may not know yourself the best way to do that. So work together with your partner to get each other to this better emotional place. And the last thought I want to leave you with is that when you're in the midst of stress, it's hard to deal with anything else, right? It's so all-consuming. It's just absorbing as a state. But one of the smart things that we've seen our couples do is they say, this is a test, and we can pass this test. This is a difficult circumstance. We have a sick child. We have a child who's really not well. But we have to rise to the occasion. How can we set aside our differences? How can we stop squabbling and rise to the challenge of managing this specific issue that is so troubling to us right now? How can we get on the other side of this in a better way? And healthy couples, smart couples, see the stress, they get it on their radar, they respect it. And when they do this, they team up to really resolve the issue in an effective way. And then what's really great about this phenomenon, I believe it's a real phenomenon, and there's a little data to support it, is that once you've succeeded in doing that, you feel so much stronger as a couple. Then you say, oh, that happened? You know, so you really think that having this difficulty with the taxes is really going to be a problem? Because we've dealt with much bigger problems than this totally successfully. So use stress as an opportunity to say, this is a good relationship. This is a way of evaluating your relationship. If you and your partner can regulate and manage stress well, that is probably going to be way more important than your personality traits and all these other characteristics that we've talked about. Your ability to team up and really be a partnership, really be an effective unit that sort of has, like an armor around it, like you're an armor-plated relationship, that will allow you to soothe one another on a routine basis. So team up, see stress as a test, and not only in this instance, but on Thursday, pass the test. So let me stop there. Thank you again for a great quarter. Thank you. And thanks to Emily as well.